For years, scientists believed Antarctica had a buffer until 2050. That was the timeline researchers relied on when they talked about how much time we had. But a new study has now challenged that assumption, and it comes down to a single ocean temperature threshold. Researchers have identified a temperature point that could trigger a self-sustaining collapse of the West Antarctic Ice Sheet. And here's what makes this especially concerning. The additional warming needed to reach that threshold may be far smaller than scientists once expected. Now, before you think this means Antarctica is suddenly collapsing, it doesn't. The study does not say that collapse has already begun, but it raises a much more important question. How much of that 2050 buffer was ever really there? In the next few minutes, we're going to look at the exact temperature threshold, the ocean mechanism behind it, and what this research actually tells us about how much time may really be left. Because there's a crucial difference between approaching a threshold and crossing it, and that difference could determine how much time the world actually has. Let's get into it. Let me start with the basic geography, because you need this picture in your head before any of the new research will make sense. The West Antarctic Ice Sheet sits largely on bedrock that's actually below sea level. That makes it fundamentally different and fundamentally more vulnerable than ice sheets sitting on solid ground above the waterline. It's held in place at its edges by floating extensions called ice shelves. These act like a cork in a bottle, or a doorstop wedged against the ice behind it, preventing that ice from simply sliding into the ocean. Thwaites Glacier is the largest and most closely watched piece of the system, roughly the size of Florida. It sits in a region called the Amundsen Sea embayment, alongside its neighboring glacier, Pine Island. Between the two of them, the ice draining out of this region has more than doubled since the 1990s. The Amundsen Sea sector alone now accounts for roughly 8% of the entire planet's current rate of sea level rise. A genuinely enormous contribution from one relatively small corner of one continent. The reason this specific region behaves so differently from the rest of Antarctica comes down to a mechanism called marine ice sheet instability. Understanding it is the key to understanding why this new research is such a big deal. The bedrock beneath West Antarctica slopes downward as you move inland, away from the coast, rather than upward like a normal hill. Because of that, once the ocean starts eating into the ice at its edges, gravity doesn't resist that process. It accelerates it. Warmer water melts the base of the ice. The ice thins. Thinner ice retreats more easily off that downward sloping bed. That exposes even more ice to warm water behind it. It's a feedback loop that, once it truly gets going, doesn't need any additional warming to keep running. It becomes self-sustaining, driven purely by its own geometry. That's the theoretical mechanism scientists have understood for years. What's new, and what this recent study actually did, is put a specific number on it for the first time. Researchers modeling this system identified a threshold of just 0.25 degrees Celsius of additional ocean warming at depth around West Antarctica. That's not global average surface temperature, which is the number you usually hear in climate coverage. It's the temperature of deep ocean water, specifically in contact with the base of these glaciers. That water comes from a current called Circumpolar Deep Water that's been increasingly intruding onto the continental shelf and washing directly against the ice. Crossed that quarter-degree threshold in the model, and the paper's authors found that collapse becomes self-sustaining. That means it would continue on its own trajectory even if all warming stopped completely the moment that line was crossed. The sea level rise associated with a full West Antarctic ice sheet collapse under this mechanism is genuinely staggering, roughly 4 meters, or about 13 feet. That's distributed over centuries rather than years, but essentially irreversible on any timescale that matters to human civilization once that self-sustaining process actually begins. Now, here's where I need to be genuinely careful, because this is exactly the point where the headline version of this story and the actual scientific finding start to diverge, and I don't want to give you the exaggerated version. The study does not claim that threshold has already been crossed. I want to say that as plainly as I can, because it's the single most important clarification in this entire video. What the research identifies is the specific point in a detailed physical model, where the system tips from a state that could theoretically stabilize if warming stopped, into a state that keeps collapsing under its own momentum regardless of what emissions do afterward. That's an enormously significant thing to have pinned down with a real number attached to it. It is not the same as an announcement that the threshold has been breached and the collapse is now unfolding in real time. So why does the headline framing of "crossed a line scientists said wouldn't happen until 2050 carry real weight, even with that caveat? Because of what this new, precise threshold does to the older, more comfortable assumption. For years, the working consensus, reflected in major assessments like the recent U.S. sea level rise report, was that Thwaites specifically wasn't expected to meaningfully affect global sea levels before 2050. The genuinely dangerous, rapid collapse scenarios weren't expected to fully develop until well into the 2100s. That assumption was never a guarantee. Researchers who study this glacier have always described the timeline as one of the largest sources of uncertainty in all of long-term climate science. But it functioned in practice as a kind of buffer, a sense that even in a bad case scenario, there was decades of runway before this specific mechanism became an urgent near-term problem. What this new research does is take that buffer and show, for the first time with real precision, just how thin it actually is. 1/4 degree Celsius of additional deep ocean warming around West Antarctica is not a large number. It's not a distant end-of-century target. Given the trajectory of ocean warming already documented in this exact region over recent decades, and given that separate independent warnings, including from prominent climate scientists, have suggested the broader 1.5 degree global warming threshold could be reached by 2050, sooner than many earlier projections assumed. The runway between where we are right now and where this specific irreversible mechanism kicks in looks considerably shorter than the old 2050 framing implied. That's the actual, honest version of crossed a line scientists said wouldn't happen until 2050. Not that the line has been crossed today, but that the number defining where that line sits has turned out to be so small that the old assumption about when we'd reach it no longer holds up. Let me walk you through the observational evidence that's already accumulating on the ground. Because this isn't purely a model sitting in a research paper, disconnected from what's actually happening in Antarctica right now. Grounding lines, the point where floating ice shelves meet the glacier and ice still resting on bedrock, have been retreating along the Amundsen Sea coastline for years, most dramatically on Thwaites itself. That retreat is being driven by ocean water roughly 2 degrees Celsius warmer than the historical average. That warm water is flowing directly toward the grounding line and driving stronger than usual melting from below. Separately, researchers monitoring conditions directly beneath Thwaites' eastern ice shelf, using instruments moored under the ice itself, documented actual warming of that sub-ice shelf cavity. They also documented an increasing meltwater fraction in the upper layer of water trapped beneath the ice. Direct physical measurement, not projection. And, in one of the more striking recent findings, drilling expeditions at the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf are underway, part of an international project specifically studying West Antarctica's vulnerability to warming. They're working to answer exactly the question this new threshold study raises, precisely when and under what conditions the West Antarctic Ice Sheet crosses from a stable to an unstable state. So here's the genuinely uncomfortable position climate scientists find themselves describing right now. I think it's worth hearing in their own careful, hedged language rather than in a flattened headline. It is not yet clear whether Thwaites has crossed the threshold of irreversible retreat. But the retreat that's already been observed is unambiguous. It's accelerated considerably over the past 4 decades, and it's continuing to move further and faster into territory that researchers describe as approaching, even if not confirmed to have crossed, the point of no return. I want to give you the fairer, more reassuring side of this story too, because a responsible breakdown includes it, and because it's genuinely part of the actual research, not something added just to soften the blow. The same National Geographic reporting on this exact body of research includes an important qualifier. It's fairly certain that Thwaites specifically won't have a major effect on global sea levels before 2050, and a separate recent study on the glacier's dynamics suggests there may still be time to stave off the most catastrophic pathway if serious mitigation happens soon. Some of the processes that could eventually cause rapid, dramatic ice loss might begin within the next few decades, but their full, dramatic effects on sea level aren't expected to fully unfold until well into the 2100s. That's not the same as saying everything is fine. It's saying that even in this genuinely alarming research, the timeline for the worst outcomes remains a matter of centuries, not years. That leaves a real window for the emissions choices made over the next decade to meaningfully change where this system ultimately lands relative to that threshold. Let me connect this back to something more immediate and more tangible, because 4 meters of sea level rise over centuries can be hard to feel as a real present threat. The Amundsen Sea sector, driven largely by Thwaites and Pine Island, is already responsible for roughly 8% of the entire planet's current sea level rise, right now, today. That's independent of whether any long-term irreversible threshold has been crossed. That's not a future projection. That's an ongoing measured contribution. It's part of why coastal cities from Miami to London are already factoring accelerating sea level rise into infrastructure planning that has to account for decades, not years, of lead time. Every additional fraction of a degree of ocean warming that pushes the system closer to that 0.25 degree threshold doesn't just matter in some distant hypothetical collapse scenario. It's already showing up incrementally in the baseline sea level that coastal communities are contending with today, and it will keep showing up faster. As this new research suggests, we're closer to the tipping point than the old 2050 framing implied. So where does that leave the honest summary of this story? Here's what I think is the fair, complete version. A new study has, for the first time, identified a specific quantified ocean warming threshold: 0.25 degrees Celsius at depth around West Antarctica. Beyond that threshold, West Antarctic ice sheet collapse becomes self-sustaining and irreversible. It would ultimately commit the planet to roughly 4 meters of sea level rise over subsequent centuries. That threshold has not been confirmed as crossed, but the observed pace of ocean warming in this exact region over recent decades, combined with independent warnings that the broader global warming trajectory may be running ahead of earlier 2050-era assumptions, means the comfortable buffer that framing implied looks considerably thinner than it did just a few years ago. The worst-case timeline for this specific mechanism still unfolds over centuries, and researchers are explicit that meaningful emissions reductions in the years immediately ahead can still influence where the system ultimately settles relative to that threshold. This is not a story about an already unfolding catastrophe. It's a story about how much closer the line turned out to be than we thought, and how much that changes the urgency of the decisions being made about it right now, this decade, not in some comfortable future window that research like this keeps quietly pulling closer. I also want to address the researchers' own framing directly, because I think it's the most honest way to close this out. The paper itself describes the next few years as a period in which the trajectory of deep ocean warming around Antarctica will become considerably clearer, and a period in which the emissions choices being made right now will continue to influence exactly where the system ends up relative to the threshold the study identifies. That's not fatalism. That's an explicit statement that the window for influencing this outcome is still open, even as the size of that window has turned out to be smaller than a lot of people assumed just a few years ago. Here's the practical takeaway. I want to be honest that this is a different kind of practical than the storm or wildfire videos I usually walk you through, because there's no evacuation route to know or emergency kit to pack for a threshold like this one. What this research actually calls for is a recalibration of urgency, not a change in immediate behavior. If you live in a coastal community, this is a legitimate reason to pay closer attention to how your local infrastructure planning accounts for accelerating rather than steady, long-term sea level rise. The assumptions underlying a lot of existing coastal planning were built around exactly the kind of not before 2050 timeline that this research is now complicating. And more broadly, understanding a story like this accurately, rather than through either the falsely reassuring version or the falsely apocalyptic one, is genuinely part of being equipped to evaluate the policy decisions being made about climate mitigation over the next several years. The actual scientific literature is telling us that decade specifically carries real weight. Before you go, I want to ask you something. I think it gets at how differently people process a slow, decades to centuries threat versus an immediate one. When you hear about a threshold like this, 4 meters of sea level rise, unfolding over centuries rather than years, does that timescale make it feel less urgent to you? Or does the fact that the threshold itself keeps turning out to be closer than expected make the opposite true? Drop a comment and tell me honestly. I think that tension between the length of the timeline and the shrinking size of the buffer is exactly what makes a story like this so hard for most people, and most coverage, to get right. If this gave you the honest, precise version of this research instead of either the exaggerated headline or a falsely comforting dismissal of it, hit that like button. It genuinely helps careful, no-hype breakdowns like this one reach more people instead of the oversimplified version crowding them out. Subscribe to Nimora Proof so you're here for the next update on this. The observational data on Thwaites keeps coming in, and I'll walk you through exactly what it means the moment it changes the picture. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.